Okay, hello everyone. I just learned something new about um, recording. I didn't know that this little circle down here was the opportunity for me to put my face on the recordings. So, just wanted to make a few comments about Chapter 18 from our textbook, Radio Comes of Age. And once again, this chapter covers the years 1900 to 1945. If you look at the original PowerPoint that I have posted for this class, you can click on this code right here and go in and just play around with the Morse code and see how it worked. You can type in a message and then it'll give you the code and how it looked. You can watch it type your message, and you can copy your code and reverse it and put it in the message box, and you'll get your message below. So try that when you have some time. But anyway, this slide just talks about how radio was an outgrowth of work done on the telegraph by Samuel Morse, who's shown at the right, in 1844. And that's how the first telegraph, that's probably a replica, or it might be a photo of an original telegraph. Now here we talk about some more pioneers of electronic technology. And another pioneer was Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison gave us the ability to record sounds in 1877 with his invention of the phonograph. And I have a picture of the phonograph here. Though this machine could record and play back sound, it was relatively fragile, and the foil-covered cylinders could not be reproduced and did not stand up to repeated playing. So it looks like recording was not available just yet. Another pioneer is Heinrich Hertz and Guglielmo Marconi. And Marconi is the person you see here at the right. He developed the commercially viable wireless telegraph in 1894. And then later, Reginald Fessenden, after working for Thomas Edison's company, started his own company and patented numerous inventions in telephony, and telegraphy. Have to get those accents correct. Now, David Sarnoff, shown on the front cover of this Time magazine, was among the first to see radio's potential as a tool for mass communication. And with any technology, what you're going to see when you study any new technology is that it usually starts out as a novelty, and then someone will come along later and realize quickly how that piece of novelty and whatever you're using it for can be used for commercial purposes and for making money. So David Sarnoff is given credit for seeing radio's potential as a tool for mass communication. CBS founder William Paley also saw radio's potential as an advertising medium that incidentally provided entertainment. And while we're at it, and I'll mention this later, KDKA was the first commercial radio station, and it went on the air in 1920. And that ushered in the golden age of radio, in which radio was the dominant medium for home entertainment. Radio was also a major source of news, offering an intimacy and immediacy that newspapers couldn't match. So radio was everything you wanted. It brought on the immediacy and all of that. So quite naturally, somewhere in the history of newspapers, you'll probably see that they might have felt a little threatened, kind of like what you see happening today with the internet, because it did have an impact on how newspapers and how they had to be innovative if they wanted to survive the age of the internet. This slide, and when you have time, you can go back and read more details, but it just talks about the role of wireless technology in the Titanic ship tragedy. And what we know now is that the wireless telegraph on the Titanic was owned and operated by Marconi Company, who we just heard about Marconi. And it was considered one of the best systems in the world with a range of up to 1,600 kilometers, which is the equivalent of 1,000 miles. However, the system's electronics created so much noise that it disrupted the wireless systems of other ships in the area. And so throughout the day, this was back on April 14th of that year of 1912, throughout the day, 4 ships, all within 60 miles of the Titanic, had warned of icebergs in the area, but because of all that noise, the Titanic did not get the information. And kind of like what you see in the movie about the Titanic, it crashed into that iceberg. And we know what else happened. So, now this slide goes on to talk about some things that became a result out of this tragedy. For one, they had a conference and they met about it, and then out of that conference came the Radio Act of 1912. The Radio Act of 1912 required people to be trained on these radios because they were not well trained. They just got in there, and so that was mandatory out of this act, and some other items were required because of out of this after they met and came up with the Radio Act of 1912. So more of that information is on this slide. I'm not going to read all of it because I don't want to make this file too big. Okay, with this slide, remember in the previous chapter we talked about the different crises in the first part of the last century, the first say 40 years. One of those crises was World War I. And when we have wars, back then it was very common for the government to halt production of different items and even food and other items, and food and all kind of resources. So keep in mind at this time radio was really big. The technology used to invent radio, starting with the telegraph and then the phonograph and then the radio. So what would happen was all the different companies such as General Electric and Westinghouse and Marconi, everyone was trying to do something special with the technology from what I understand. And so they were all going in their different directions. But because we were in World War I, all these companies were encouraged to pool their patents and try to support the military because all they needed all the resources to go toward the military effort between 1917 and 1919 because we were in a world war. We were in World War I. We needed all the resources. Okay, radio's growing popularity. So by now we know, by 1920, we know that radio is pretty popular. We've come through World War I, or we're kind of toward the end of it, and we see that radio. We see how intimate it can be with people sitting by listening, even though we don't have moving pictures like we would later in later years with TV. Radio is still something very special. In fact, the 1920s have been called the golden era of sports. For one, people enjoyed sports, but if they couldn't be at a sporting event, they could sit by the radio and listen to especially baseball games during real time. And another very important piece of history for radio happened on November 2nd, 1920, when station KDKA reported the presidential election returns for Harding and Cox. And they did so from a makeshift studio at the East Pittsburgh Works of Westinghouse. Also, music, sports, talks, and special events were soon being regularly aired on this station. So here's a page of the that shows a sample of the U.S. Census, and we know that the U.S. Census is taken every 10 years. So by 1930, keep in mind radio has been on the scene in the 1920s, but still, and what we see happening with radio is that people now can get their news much faster than they would if they waited until the newspaper was printed and either brought by train or by someone in a horse and buggy, or maybe they had the early cars by then, but it just took longer for you to get news and a lot of other information. But now with radio, people are beginning to see how news and information and even entertainment could travel much faster. So with that, the government, by the time the 1930 census came around, they had a question on the census about radio. So let me just circle that. And if you look at this sample of the census, it says radio set, and and if they had a radio set, you would circle, put an R by their name. So just wanted to show you that because it is now a something that is very important, and the government even sees it as something important for families. With this slide, we see how we learn about radio being a disruptive technology, which is a new term. What do we mean by disruptive technology? This means that disruptive technology is defined as an innovation that significantly changes the activities or habits of consumers, industries, or businesses. Radio informed and modified cultural norms and entertainment. It created consumer demand for products through advertising, and new entertainment stars became popular. Sporting events could be followed in real time. So radio was the internet and social media of its time. It was revolutionary. So for that, we call it a disruptive technology. So remember that term. Okay, so in the night, here's a sample of my great grandfather Bert Fears' household in 1920, and if you'll look at it, you'll see that in the 1920 census, he's about 37 years old. He was born in 1883, but they don't ask a question about the radio in 1920. Now, this is the 1930 census, and you'll see here that they began asking, do you have a radio set? Because just like the internet of today, radios were very important. And for example, during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, when everybody had to stop going to school all of a sudden, here in rural Arkansas, I heard stories about how, and I heard these stories were about children everywhere where they would have to try to do homework on the phone. The teachers would send them homework and lessons, and they would have to try to do that on the phone. Or you might have a whole family trying to use one computer and take turns to actually do what the teachers wanted them to do. So you can imagine what the internet is to us today, what the radio was to people in the 1930s. And when this census was taken, my great grandparents did not have a radio. So this is another slide that shows they answered no. Okay, by the 1940s, now this is 10 years later, more people probably have radios, and they are not asking that question on the census. So here's my grandfather again. He's 57 now in 1940, and there appears to be no question asked about radios because it's now a way of life for people. Okay, so with radio, by 1927, things were about to get a little chaotic. A lot of people were trying to have stations on the air. By 1926, based on the existing Radio Act, Herbert Hoover, who wasn't president, Herbert Hoover, who was the Commerce Secretary, only had the power to grant licenses, not to restrict stations from operating. So, as I said, there were about 200 new stations clogging the airways, and it created a chaotic period in which nearly all radios had poor reception. And by 1927, sales of radio sets had declined sharply. So that's probably a warning. So then we have the Radio Act of 1927. And with this act, licensees did not own their channels, but could only license them as long as they operated to serve the, quote, public interest, convenience, or necessity, unquote. Okay, so the March of Time radio show. Roy Larson is instrumental in this piece of history. Larson, who originally worked at Time magazine as the GM, this show eventually became known as the March of Time. Larson also originated the term newscasting for the programming technique. And what he would do is take about 15 minutes and do a 15-minute quiz show called Pop Question. And Larson eventually took Harold Arlen's song, The March of Time, as not only a title for one of his programs, but also as the logo music. So there we have the March of Time radio show, and it came out of Time magazine. Here we have just some mention of a piece of history, and that's Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio play. This was a play he did. Now, keep in mind, this is 1938. It's not April Fool's Day. And Orson Welles dramatizes, he does a dramatization of a show called The Martian Invasion of the Earth. He was only 23 at the time, and it was funny for him to do this, but believe it or not, a lot of people were afraid and frightened. They thought this was actually happening to the Earth. And if you can see this newspaper clip front page here, it says, "Fake radio war stirs terror through U.S." So this was very serious for a lot of people. The War of the Worlds radio play. The fireside chats. Keep in mind, we're still in the age of radio. We have a crisis, and now we're in World War II. And you see President Franklin D. Roosevelt, there's the Great Depression that's just happened and all of that. So he has to comfort people. And so he created this thing where he would go and sit by, I imagine he sat by a fire, or maybe he just called it that because you really couldn't see with it being a radio broadcast. And he would talk to the nation and tell them and assure them everything would be all right. And I'm pretty sure this is where he would tell them about what the government could do for them, especially people in soup lines and just struggling from poverty. And you've got the stock market crashing, and so many things have happened. And so he used radio to communicate with people, to let them know that they would be all right. And this way of communication was known as the fireside chat. And presidents today do something a little similar. When there's a crisis, they may go on TV and talk to the nation or give the State of the Union address. And but the State of the Union is once a year, but they do other little talks where they'll come on and talk to you and just reassure you about things that are happening in the nation. And they definitely do it when there's a crisis. Okay, just wanted to end to talk a little bit about visual radio. So just by the fact of seeing the word visual there, what's getting ready to happen? Television is getting ready to come on the scene. But but what happened in World War II is that the development of TV had to be halted because of the war. All efforts went into the war. particularly efforts dealing with research of technology. So by the time television uh, came on the scene in the 1950s, it was the dominant broadcast medium. So you might imagine that radio was a little bit threatened as well by then. So, and then by the 1960s, and I don't know how early in the 1960s, but I do remember growing up as a child and seeing a few colored TV shows. But I do remember a lot of black and white ones too. So just a little bit about TV, but even though the chapter is about radio, just remember that radio is the forerunner of TV. So, I could never end a lecture or a presentation on radio without talking about our very own public radio station, KASU FM. And here are the call letters right here, 91.9 FM. This is an FM radio station. Also, it is a public radio station, and you're always welcome to send a donation because it is listener and sponsor supported. And it is not, we don't, they don't do ads from businesses, but we do take sponsorships and listener donations. I also like to give a little regional history of one of my favorite radio stations that I've listened to since since I've lived in Arkansas, probably, Eastern Arkansas rather. And that is WDIA, which is a commercial station out of Memphis. It's an AM station. The letters DIA stands for the original owner's daughter's name, Diana, DIA. Even though he was white, the station was formatted for the black audience, and it started with the format of rhythm and blues, and eventually would have a gospel goodwill hour. No, I might have that mixed up with my Helena station, but they did have a gospel radio station. So that is historic WDIA, and they're still on the radio now. WDIA, this slide just shows a sample of what a live show would have looked like in the earlier days. You see the call letters in the background. And you can click on any of these links right here to learn more about WDIA or one of the most popular radio personalities, and that's Mr. Bobby OJ, you see sitting there in the chair. Bobby passed away in May 2022, I believe, and he was doing what he loved when he passed away. He was actually on the set working that morning, and he went for a break between two of the segments of the show, and I was just happened to be listening that day, and I noticed that he didn't come back on the air, and I was waiting, and I think I finally just turned my radio off and moved on to doing something else. And later that day, I did find out on YouTube that the reason he didn't come back is because he had transitioned. So just a shout out to one of my favorite hosts, and just put his name in sometime in YouTube or click on one of these links to learn more about his contributions to radio. And that will end our lecture, and we got some thunder coming, so I think I'd better stop right here. See you in the next chapter.